Who doesn't love lakes? For many people, a visit to a lake, especially somewhere isolated in the countryside, far away from the commotion of a major city, is a source of leisure, of rest and recuperation. They are serene. They're filled with fresh air, and spending time in their environs was and remains a ready source of treatment for individuals suffering from pulmonary illnesses throughout history, with the therapeutic value of the lakeside air seen as a relief from many respiratory ailments and urban pollution. They're also a site of meditation for many people, and the serenity they provide has inspired many of the finest works of poetry and prose in various languages. But Lake Karachay in Russia, while no less beautiful than any other lake, is probably one of the few in which you would not go swimming under any circumstances, and that's because you would probably die. Lake Karachay is located in the Ural Mountains in Russia's Siberia. Admittedly, this likely already made it not really suited for swimming in the first place. The lake is located around 85 kilometers northeast of the regional capital of Chelyabinsk, in a city in which the average temperature in the winter is around minus 10 degrees Celsius, and where summer temperatures have reached a record low of exactly 0 degrees Celsius, enough to cause water to freeze over entirely. The mean temperature of the water of lake nearby Vildy, one of the largest lakes in the Urals, at the height of summer, is only around 18 degrees, so significantly less than the minimum temperature of about 28 that's recommended for immersion by America's Red Cross Water Safety Manual, thanks to them. The much smaller Lake Karachay, for its part, has a year-round average temperature of around 14 degrees. But cold discomfort is not the primary reason one would not saunter into it for a swim. You see, the water is absolutely lethal. That is because a legacy of nuclear waste dumping into the lake by Soviet authorities changed the picturesque waters into a kind of biblical plague, unfit for maritime life or human venture. While such a practice was not uncommon in the Soviet Union and has even been observed in other places too, the sheer amount of garbage spewed into the lake sets it apart from any other and leads it to rank comparably to its fellow Soviet-era disaster zone of Chernobyl in the volume of nuclear radioactivity generated. Like Chernobyl, the area around Lake Karachay was a site of Soviet nuclear activity. While the world had stood appalled at the chaotic destruction meted out by the US's bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the Soviet Union stood a little bit jealous. In its endeavor to build its own nuclear-grade weapons arsenal, it constructed a series of sites intended to nurture its nuclear aspirations. One of these was a planned town codenamed City 40, alternatively Chelyabinsk 40, and today known as Ozyorsk. The town was built to house the workers of a nearby nuclear facility known as Mayak, or Lighthouse, and City 40 was effectively to Mayak what Pripyat was to Chernobyl. Mayak was built in 1948 using the forced labor of some 70,000 Gulag inmates. It soon became one of the Soviet Union's most important nuclear development sites. City 40 became only the second city in the world to produce plutonium for use in atomic bombs after Richland in the US, a town which housed workers contributing to the Manhattan Project at the nearby Hanford nuclear complex, which developed the material later used in the bombing of Nagasaki. Like any nuclear plant, Mayak produced a lot of nuclear waste. Unlike most nuclear power plants, in the West at least, the waste was not handled responsibly and was instead chucked into the rivers around City 40, exposing the inhabitants of nearby settlements. Eventually, it was decided to find a single repository in which to pool all of this nuclear waste. That, fatefully, turned out to be the nearby reservoir of Lake Karachay. The name Lake Karachay means black water or black creek in several Turkic languages such as Tatar. Karachay was not a big lake, measuring only around 0.5 square kilometers or 15 hectares at its peak, and well hidden in the vast expanses of Siberia. It was really more like a natural bog, had a maximum depth of only 1.25 meters, and the total volume of water in the lake was about 400,000 cubic meters. Both Mayak and Lake Karachay were located not only in an isolated part of Russia, but also close to the frontier with Kazakhstan, itself a key location in the Soviet nuclear arms project, and where the USSR's first nuclear bomb was successfully detonated at the Semipalatinsk test site in August 1949. Given its small size, Lake Karachay was not big enough to provide sufficient cooling water for Mayak's reactors. It was, however, right on the doorstep of the site and therefore conveniently close enough that it could be used as a dumping ground for nuclear waste, as was the case with the other rivers nearby. The lake rapidly became incredibly contaminated, but this would reach a whole new level in 1957, 8 years after the successful test of the so-called first Lightning bomb at Semipalatinsk and with the Soviet drive to develop more nuclear capabilities in full flow. That year, the already high contamination level of the lake went absolutely supernova with what was retrospectively known as the Kyshtym disaster. The disaster took place at Mayak on the 29th of September, when unsafe and irresponsible storage of nuclear materials led to an explosion in an underground cooling tank. This sent huge amounts of nuclear waste, such as ammonium nitrate and acetate, skyrocketing into the air. The event is considered to be the third deadliest nuclear accident in history, after the 2011 Fukushima disaster and the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, which, if the disaster at Kyshtym had been responsibly investigated and learnt from, may have actually been avoided. Unfortunately, responsible oversight was exactly what wasn't on the menu. Details of the event, as well as the vast scope of consequences, were obscured by the Soviet authorities for many years after. As the toxic plume from the explosion rose into the atmosphere, it created a radioactive cloud which moved upwards of 300 kilometers from the site of the accident and resulted in the contamination of an area that was up to 20,000 square kilometers in size. It also resulted in the transfer of 11 billion curies of high-level nuclear waste into the wells at sites all around Mayak, much of which dived headfirst into Lake Karachay. After the disaster, nuclear waste was no longer dumped into the rivers around Mayak, but there was nothing to be done about Karachay, which was by now absolutely polluted to the gills. Despite this, the Kyshtym disaster was kept secret by Soviet authorities right up until the end of the Soviet Union, almost certainly exposing the residents of surrounding districts to radioactive contamination for all of that time. Details of the extent of the disaster saw light for the first time in the late 1970s, when Russian dissident and agronomist Zores Medvedev published a detailed account of the accident after having defected to the West. He did so first with hazards of nuclear power in 1977, and later in greater depth with the nuclear disaster in the Urals in 1979. While rates of cancer and birth defects in Chelyabinsk region rose dramatically, the reasons which lay behind this were not common knowledge. And why would they be? After all, City 40 did not officially exist. As a closed city, its purpose was kept hidden only to those working there. It didn't appear on any maps, and non-residents were not allowed to set foot in it. Ozyorsk remains a closed city to this day, with access granted only to visitors in possession of a special pass, and likewise, even its residents are only permitted to leave with a special pass of their own. And even the name of the Kyshtym disaster in some ways symbolizes the great obscurity of the entire project. Kyshtym is a relatively large town, about 20 kilometers west of the reactor at Mayak, no doubt affected in some way by the explosion, but not really the epicenter as the name would suggest. Any local residents who did think to inquire why certain select population transfers were being carried out by large groups of soldiers in the years after 1957 were met with the information that rising health problems were the result of some vague special disease, and that they should rather swiftly hush their gums on the matter. It's generally thought that tens of thousands may have died from the health consequences of this disaster. Today, Lake Karachay is so polluted that spending 30 minutes there would result in a lethal dose of radiation. That's about 300 rontgens. Do you recall how in the HBO series Chernobyl, what was believed to be a dose of 3.6 rontgens was enough to cause vomiting, dismissed as not great, but terrible? Well, yeah, a 30-minute paddle in Lake Karachay would result in a dose of around 100 times more than that. Conclusion being, you definitely die. Even just standing next to the lake for an hour would produce the same effect. Although radiation levels are seemingly falling somewhat, it remains one of the most polluted places in the world. Starting in the 1960s, the lake also began to dry out. Its area dropped from 0.5 square kilometers to just 0.15 by the end of 1993. In 1968, a drought in the region caused radioactive dust to be carried away from the drying area of the lake, irradiating perhaps 500,000 people with 185 petabecquerels of radiation. To account for its extreme pollution and volatility, between 1978 and 1986, the lake was filled with about 10,000 hollow concrete blocks to prevent sediments from shifting. The lake is now entirely covered by concrete and inaccessible to the general public. But even several generations later, children from the area continue to suffer health effects likely related to the mass contamination of the area. Moreover, an article by the International Atomic Energy Agency from 2000 stated that the risks posed by the toxic lake had not really subsided. The paper, written by Dr. Alexei Marushkin of the Moscow Physical Engineering Institute in Ozyorsk, described how a volume of polluted underground water had formed under the lake, swelling hourly. It went on to mention that contaminated water migrated with a speed of about 100 meters per year, therefore risking approaching a nearby river called the Mayak. Dr. Marushkin concluded that if movement of the the contaminated fluid continued, radionuclides would begin to penetrate into both the Mayak and Taka rivers, potentially leading to further disaster for nearby human populations. By 2016, further work had been carried out to fill in the lake with even more special concrete blocks, rock, and dirt. The water was first backfilled in November 2015, then monitored before adding another layer of rock and dirt, effectively attempting to cancel the existence of the putrid lake out entirely. Mayak, astonishingly, remains open and operational. Indeed, it is Russia's most important nuclear site to this very day. And that's where we end today's video. Thanks for watching.